In this lesson, we are going to multiply decimal numbers and model it with a grid. Here is our grid. It is a grid made up of 100 squares. Each small square or unit represents decimal 01. The whole grid represents one whole, or 100 units. Remember that multiplication means groups of. For example, 6 times 3 means 6 groups of 3. Our task is to multiply decimal 4 by decimal 7. We are going to use this grid to model. Our first step, we are going to shade in some columns on the grid. We are going to shade in 0.4, which represents 40 out of 100, so I will shade in 40 squares, or 4/10, which is 4 columns. 1, 2, 3, 4. So I have 0.4 shaded on this grid. Now I'm going to shade in decimal 7, which means 7/10, which could mean 7 rows, or 70 squares, but I'm going to go the opposite direction. And it will look like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. My next step, count the number of squares in the overlap area. It's this area here. These were the squares representing decimal 4. So I'm looking at this shaded area. If I count those up, I will have 28 squares. The overlap area represents the product, meaning the answer of a multiplication statement, of decimal 4 times decimal 7. The fraction of the entire grid of the overlap squares are 28 over 100. As a decimal 28. Therefore, decimal 4 times decimal 7 is 0.28. We're going to practice that again. Here is our statement. 0.2 times 0.6. First, I'm going to shade in 0.2, which means 2 columns or 20 units. I'm going to shade in 2 columns. Now I'm going to multiply by 0.6, which means 6 rows or 60 units. I'm going to show it with 6 rows. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now I'm going to look at what overlaps. And I see that right here. I count the number of squares. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 12 out of 100 is 0.12. Therefore, the answer is 0.12. Now it is your turn. You are going to multiply and model 0.8 times 0.7 and 0.2 multiply 0.7. Use the same example I showed you before, highlighting or checking off or marking the squares in one direction and then the squares in the other direction. Pause the video here. When you are finished, continue on to the next part. There are 2 more questions for you to do, and this involves estimating and using a calculator. Here's our multiplication sentence. 0.9 times 6.1. We're going to round an estimate. Decimal 9 becomes 1. 6.1 rounds to 6. 1 times 6 is 6. Circle the answer closest to my estimate. 5.49, 54.9, or 549. It's this one. When I multiply that with a calculator, my answer is 5.49. You're going to do B and C. Remember, when you add or subtract decimal numbers, the numbers line up according to the place value, and the decimal stays in the same place. When you multiply decimal numbers, the decimal changes. For example, when I multiplied decimal 9 by 6.1, I can simply multiply 9 by 61. I will get 549. But you will see there are 2 decimal numbers or places represented. Here is 1 and here is the other. 1 space and 2. So I must show 2 decimal places in my answer. That is why 549 becomes 5.49. I move my decimal here and here. I'm showing 2 decimal places because I have 1 here and 1 here. Double check that with a calculator. Good luck.